The man he was before the losses. Part 1. The photograph. There was a photograph in the desk drawer that Chuck Norris had not looked at in 11 years. He found it on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1975 when he was cleaning the desk. Not a scheduled cleaning, but the kind that happens when you've been sitting in the same room for a decade and the accumulated sediment of that occupation begins to require attention. He was working through the second drawer, the one that held the composition notebook and the Federation documents and the things whose preservation was deliberate rather than inadvertent, when he encountered, at the very back, a photograph he had placed there in 1964 and had not retrieved since. He was 23 years old in the photograph. He was standing outside the first tournament venue he had ever entered as a competitor, a high school gymnasium in Inglewood, California, in his clean new training clothes, with an expression on his face that he recognized immediately and had not seen in the mirror for a very long time. He was about to go in for the first time. He looked like someone who did not know how this was going to go. He set the photograph on the desk and sat back and looked at it with the quality of attention he had developed over 15 years of studying things he needed to understand accurately. The patient, receptive quality of someone who is trying to see rather than to confirm. He was 35 years old. He was the world's undefeated karate champion, retired. He had founded a federation and built a system. He had trained 300 students to black belt and taught Steve McQueen and trained with Bruce Lee and appeared in 2 films. His name meant something in specific circles and was gaining weight in wider ones. The man in the photograph was none of those things. He was a 23-year-old from Oklahoma who had just been discharged from the Air Force with a black belt in Tang Soo Do and a specific quality of hunger and a training schedule that was designed around the belief, not yet tested, that if he worked hard enough at the right things for long enough, he could be someone worth knowing about. Chuck sat with the photograph for a long time. Part 2. What the 23-year-old thought. He tried to remember. Not the facts. He knew the facts. He had entered his first tournament in April 1964. He had lost definitively to a competitor whose fundamentals were better developed and whose competition experience gave him the ability to read Chuck's pattern in the first 2 minutes and respond to it before Chuck understood the pattern existed. He had come home and trained for another month and entered again and lost again. This had continued. What he was trying to remember was the quality of the internal experience, what it had felt like to be that person in that specific moment, before the losses had done their work and before the wins had done their different work. What had the 23-year-old thought was going to happen? He closed his eyes and tried. The 23-year-old had thought he was ready. This was the embarrassing part, not the thought itself, which was understandable, but the specific quality of the readiness he had believed in. He had believed he was ready in the way that someone believes they are ready when they have never been tested at the actual level. He had trained for 4 years, in Korea and at March Air Force Base and in the early months of the dojo. He had developed through that training a specific physical and technical capability, and he had extrapolated from that capability, from the fact of its existence, from the evidence of the training log, to the conclusion that it would translate to competition. He had been wrong about the extrapolation, not about the capability. The capability was real, but the translation from capability to competitive performance was not automatic. It required a specific kind of knowledge that only competition could provide, and he had not had that knowledge yet because he had not competed yet, and he had not understood, before his first tournament, that the knowledge existed as a separate category from the capability. The 23-year-old had walked into the Inglewood gymnasium believing that what he had was enough. It had not been enough. It had been the beginning of enough. Chuck opened his eyes and looked at the photograph again. The expression on the young man's face, which was his own face, which he knew better than anyone else's, and which was recognizable to him even without the specific features that confirmed identity. The expression was the expression of someone who had done everything they knew how to do, and who was about to find out whether everything they knew how to do was sufficient. It was the expression of someone standing at the edge of genuinely not knowing. Chuck could not remember the last time he had stood at that edge. Not in martial arts. He had retired from competition in 1974, and the competition had produced its knowledge, and he had taken the knowledge with him. Not in teaching. He had been teaching for 12 years and had developed, through that 12 years, a practical understanding of the full range of what teaching in this specific domain required. Not in the Federation. The Federation had produced its own knowledge, its lessons about organization and governance, and the specific forms of betrayal that organizations invite. He had not stood at the edge of genuinely not knowing since the acting classes, since the beginning of the film work, since the days when he was, in a specific domain, the person he had been in April 1964, someone who had capability but not the translated knowledge, who had the foundation but not the superstructure, who was at the beginning of finding out whether what he had was enough to become something. Part 3. The thing the losses gave him. He had lost 10 fights before the winning began. This was the documented fact, the part of the record that was always cited when the story of his competitive career was told, by journalists, by the martial arts press, by the oral tradition of the community. He had lost 10, and then he had won, and then he had never lost again. The narrative shape of it was clean, the preparation period, the breakthrough, the sustained excellence. It was a true narrative, but it was not the complete one. The complete version included what had happened inside the 10 losses. He picked up the composition notebook, the one with the Chun Cook Do formulations in it, and turned to the back, where the early pages held the training logs from the 1964-1968 period. He read through them with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he was trying to understand, rather than confirm. The logs were brief and functional: date, session content, opponent if a tournament, result. But reading them in sequence, in the context of the photograph on the desk, he began to see something that the brevity of the individual entries had obscured. The losses were not a preparation period followed by a breakthrough. The losses were the curriculum. Each loss had taught something specific, not just the tactical lesson, not just the adjustment to the training that each loss indicated, but something more fundamental, the lesson of what it felt like to be in a situation where your best was not enough, and to stay in that situation and to not leave. This was a knowledge that winning could not provide. Winning confirmed what you already knew. Losing required you to go somewhere you hadn't been, into the specific territory of inadequacy, of facing the gap between what you could do and what was required, of discovering that the gap was real, and that the way to close it was through more work that would produce more adequacy, that would be tested again and might again be found insufficient. Most people, when they encountered that gap, left. They found a way to avoid the test, or they reframed the test as something other than a test, or they stopped testing altogether. The 10 losses had been 10 encounters with the gap, and Chuck had not left, and the not leaving had produced something that could not have been produced any other way. He looked at the photograph again. The 23-year-old standing outside the Inglewood gymnasium did not know about the gap. He had not encountered it yet. He was standing at the edge of what would become his curriculum, and his face carried the specific expression of someone who did not yet know that what they were about to enter was a classroom. Chuck felt something looking at that face. Not nostalgia exactly, not the soft ache of missing what was gone, something more precise, a quality of recognition, of seeing the beginning of a process that he was still inside, that was still running, that had not concluded. The man in the photograph had not yet learned what the losses would teach. The man at the desk had learned it, was still learning it, would always be learning it in new domains and new applications. The 23-year-old was not gone. He was the foundation that everything else had been built on. Part 4. The student who reminded him. His name was Thomas Park, and he had been training at the dojo for 6 weeks. He was 22 years old, the son of Korean immigrants, with the specific quality of physical intelligence that made some beginning students immediately interesting. Not the intelligence of someone who has already learned to do something well, but the intelligence of someone whose body is receptive in a way that suggests the learning will happen quickly and completely. Chuck had noticed him in the first session and had kept him in peripheral attention since. On the Tuesday afternoon when Chuck found the photograph, Thomas Park was in the intermediate class, which he had been moved to after 3 weeks because the beginner class was not providing sufficient challenge. He was running the defensive sequence from the intermediate form, the sequence that was, in Chuck's experience, the one that distinguished students who were absorbing the practice from students who were mimicking it. It required a specific quality of receptive movement, of reading the incoming force rather than resisting it, that most students didn't find until their 3rd or 4th month. Thomas Park was finding it in his 6th week. Chuck watched him from the edge of the floor. The movement was not perfect. Nothing was perfect at 6 weeks, and perfect was not the relevant standard at this stage anyway. The relevant standard was, is the principle operating? Is the student responding to what's actually there or to what they expect to be there? Thomas Park was responding to what was actually there. Chuck went over and stood next to him after the sequence ended. "Tell me what you were thinking about," he said. Thomas Park looked at him with the specific expression of a student who is uncertain whether the question is a compliment or a correction. "The form," he said tentatively. "When you were in the defensive sequence," Chuck said, "what were you thinking about in the moment?" "I was thinking about the incoming force," Thomas said. "What it was telling me, not what to do about it, what it was telling me." Chuck looked at him. The 22-year-old standing in front of him was describing, in the simple language of a beginning student, something that it had taken Chuck years of competition to understand, and that he had found his way back to through the composition notebook and the losses of the 1964–98 period, and the accumulated evidence of what worked and what didn't in teaching it to others. Listening to the incoming force, not what to do about it, what it was telling you. "Where did you learn that?" Chuck said. Thomas Park thought about it. "My father plays Baduk," he said. "The Korean board game, ancient, complex, requiring a quality of strategic patience that was completely different from the pattern recognition skills of most Western games. He taught me to play when I was young. He always said, before you place a stone, listen to what the board is telling you. The board is alive, it has an argument. Your job is to understand the argument before you enter it." Chuck was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father is right, about the board and about the form." After the class, Thomas Park stayed to ask Chuck a question. "Can I ask you something about the early losses?" he said. Chuck looked at him. The question was specific enough to suggest Thomas Park had been reading the martial arts publications where the early record was documented. "Ask it," Chuck said. "Before you won," Thomas Park said, "before any of it, what did you think was going to happen?" Part 5. The honest answer. Chuck thought about the photograph. He thought about the 23-year-old standing outside the Inglewood gymnasium with the expression of someone who did not know how this was going to go. "I thought I was ready," he said. Thomas Park waited. "I thought that the training I had done was sufficient," Chuck said, "that it would translate directly into what was required of me in competition, that the gap between what I could do and what I needed to do was smaller than it turned out to be." "Was that embarrassing?" Thomas Park said. not in a challenging way, with the genuine curiosity of someone who was asking about a future state of their own experience. It was humbling, Chuck said. Which is different, he paused. Embarrassing implies that the gap you discovered was a failure on your part, that you should have known better, that the gap shouldn't have existed. Humbling implies that the gap is simply the structure of the situation, that you couldn't have known how large it was without encountering it, and that the gap itself and the encountering of it was not a failure but a necessary part of the process. Thomas Park considered this. Did the losses feel like that at the time? No, Chuck said. At the time they felt like failures. The reframing came later, after enough losses that I had enough data to see the pattern. Each loss told me something specific about the gap. Collectively, they told me the shape of the gap and what kind of work would close it. He paused. By the time I understood that structure, I had done enough of the work to have narrowed the gap to the point where winning became possible. And before you understood the structure, Thomas said. I came back, Chuck said, every time. Not because I understood what the losses were teaching me, because leaving didn't feel right, because the practice, independent of the competition results, was something I wanted to be in. The losses were painful, but the alternative to the losses was to not be in the practice, and not being in the practice was worse. Thomas Park looked at the dojo floor. I feel that, he said, the being in the practice. I've felt it since the first session. I know, Chuck said. I can see it when you train. That feeling, does it stay? Thomas Park said. Or does it change when you get good at it? Chuck thought about the photograph, about the 23-year-old's face, about the specific quality of not knowing that the face carried, and about whether that quality persisted into the years of winning and what form it took. It changes, he said. You get better at the practice, which means the specific form of the not knowing changes. What used to be confusing becomes familiar, and the uncertainty moves to a different place, deeper in the practice or into a new domain. He paused. But the essential thing, the feeling of being at the edge of something you can't yet do, that doesn't go away if you're still developing. It just moves, and you have to keep moving with it. Part 6. What he saw in the photograph. He drove home at 6:30, which was later than usual. The conversation with Thomas Park had extended into the early evening without either of them quite noticing, the way conversations about things that matter extend without requiring the consent of the clock. He carried the photograph with him. He had taken it from the desk drawer when he left, with the intention of, he was not entirely certain of the intention. Looking at it again, showing it to Diane, putting it somewhere he could see it more easily than the back of the second drawer. He looked at it in the car, under the dome light, before he started the engine. The expression on the 23-year-old's face. What had he understood about it in the afternoon, sitting at the desk with the composition notebook and the photograph and the memory of Thomas Park asking the right questions? He had understood that the man in the photograph was not a predecessor. He was not the person Chuck had been before he became who he was. He was, in a specific and important sense, still there, still operative, still constituting a portion of what Chuck was and did and understood. The 23-year-old who had walked into the Inglewood gymnasium without knowing how it was going to go was the same person who had stood at the edge of the acting classroom 3 years earlier and who had started the dojo with the sleeping bag and the mirror on a payment plan, and who had walked through the door of the school in Korea at 19 and found the thing that had been waiting for him to find it. The not knowing was not a phase that had passed. It was the constant underneath everything else. The winning and the championships and the federation and the system, all of those were the evidence of the not knowing encountering the practice and producing knowledge. But the not knowing itself was always present, always moving to the new edge, always offering the same invitation, come to the edge and don't leave. He had always accepted the invitation. He would always accept it. That was, he understood, sitting in his car in the parking lot of the dojo at 6:30 on a Tuesday evening, the whole of what he had learned in 35 years of being alive. Come to the edge. Don't leave. The knowledge comes from not leaving. EPI Logi, the next first time. He taught the following morning's 5 o'clock session with the photograph on the corner of the desk, visible but not intrusive, a reminder of a specific quality of experience that he wanted to carry into the day. Thomas Park was not in the 5 o'clock session. He came at 9 with the morning group, and Chuck watched him from the edge of the floor with the specific attention that his best students received. Not the management attention of a teacher covering a room, but the genuine curiosity of someone interested in what was happening. What was happening with Thomas Park was the beginning of the second month. The 6-week quality, the natural intelligence expressing itself freely, the body absorbing the new inputs without the resistance that comes from established patterns, was giving way to the slightly harder quality of the second month, where the practice required refinement, and the refinement required encountering specific inadequacies and correcting them one at a time. Thomas Park was at the edge of not knowing again, different not knowing than the first session. The not knowing of someone who had been good at the beginning and was now encountering the specific difficulties of intermediate work, the place where the natural gifts didn't carry you anymore, and the sustained work began. Chuck watched him navigate it with the patience of someone who had been given a map by his father's instruction about the board game and who trusted the map even when the territory was unfamiliar. After the session, Chuck said nothing specific to Thomas Park. He nodded at him as he left, the specific nod of one practitioner to another, communicating acknowledgement without specifying what was being acknowledged. Thomas Park nodded back. He was at the edge. He was not leaving. The knowledge would come.